when Kathy asked me to be one of those preaching to help fill on with her on her renewal leave, I agreed. I've done this a couple of times before, and nobody's rioted, so I assume you're okay with me coming back in. But I had to let her know that I really wasn't sure what was going to come out this time. I, Typically speaking, when I approach things like this, when I approach my work as a therapist, a lot of my focus, arguably my vocation, is to try to bring hope, to try to bring realistic hope to those I'm talking to, working with, being around. But the reality is that's hard these days, and for obvious reasons. But this has been probably this last 2 years the hardest part of my adult life, the most difficult, stressful, overwhelming spot I have had in my professional life. This is the hardest time I've had wrestling with burnout. There's just been so much, not just for me, but from the folks I serve, from the folks I see. Demand is up, the concerns are higher, the stress is higher. And so I wasn't sure what was going to come out of my mouth. To some extent, I'm still not, but we'll ride that roller coaster together. I keep coming back. When I was a freshman in high school, 14, 15, I joined an organization called the Order of Demolay, which you're forgiven for not knowing about. It's the young men's organization associated with the Freemasons. So while my peers were learning to make campfires and play sports, I was learning to read ritual and use Robert's Rules of Order, which has been distressingly useful in my adult life. But my first job in that role, my first appointed office, was as almoner, because we liked archaic terms. Basically, I was in charge of getting cards when folks were sick, get well cards. But every meeting, second and fourth Wednesday of every month, there was a standing agenda item of sickness and distress, where the person running the meeting would call sickness and distress, and we would share who do we know, who's upset, who's sick, who's struggling. But it was a bunch of high school boys. We didn't admit those things in large groups. So it was a lot of awkward silence. And as with a lot of awkward silence among teenage boys or the choir, there were jokes. The most common of which being they read out sickness and distress, and the typical response would be, "I'm sick of being distressed." It's a long way to go for that line, but it was the title of the sermon. And it keeps coming back to me. I've forgotten about that for years, and these last 2 years, that feeling, I'm sick of being distressed, just keeps rolling over and over in my head. But still, I agreed to preach. The other hard part of preaching, as I said before, is I am not a theologian. I am not a particularly scripturally literate person. I don't have a lot of scripture in my mind. But the thing about giving a sermon is you ought to have something from the Bible to go with it. So typically when I do this, I check and see what the liturgy is, because somebody's done the work for me, and I can probably, making vague connections is what I do as a therapist. So I look at what the liturgy options are this morning, for this morning, and the first of the scripture possibilities is the last book of Job, which, when I'm struggling with suffering, seems appropriate somehow. Now, again, I am not a scriptural scholar. I will admit, never read Job, but I've been in church my entire life. I've, picked up some things. So here is my non-professional summary of what I know of Job. Job was a nice guy in ancient biblical times. Nice family, doing fairly well, and the most devout subject of God that we could find. So when the devil comes up to God and says, "I got a bet for you. I bet that I can tempt away your most devoted follower," God says, "You're on." That's Job. And so Job becomes the dartboard in the celestial game of darts that God and the devil plays. And they just start throwing darts at him. You're going to lose your cattle and your sheep and your farm and your family and your children and, your health, and not just, I feel a little weak, boils and sores. When we really want to make someone uncomfortable, we go with boils and sores, apparently, in the Bible. So he keeps getting hit with these things. And through it all, he stays faithful to God. But eventually, dart 7 or 8 or 12, I don't know, he starts to say something along the lines of, why me, God? What did I do? I've been faithful. I've done this. Why me? Job comes across very relatable to me in this story. And God, he never turns away. God wins the bet. And then I look back a little bit, spends 2 or 3 chapters in my skimming seemed to be a remarkably sarcastic rebuke of Job for asking that question. How dare you question me? Were you there when I created the world? Can you make the Leviathans come up from the bottom? Do you know what's at the heart of the whirlwind? Seems a little harsh. And then as Stuart read for us, Job eventually says, no, you're right. I don't know. I don't get it. I can't do what you do. I don't know what you know. I can't see what you see. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have questioned. And then in the last half of the 42nd and final chapter of the book of Job, God says, okay, and gives him what he had seen, what he'd had before and more. A new farm, a new family, a whole lot of sheep and cattle, new children. And not for nothing, Job treats his daughters as well as his sons, kind of they get an inheritance too. Very progressive for Job. It's an interesting story about suffering. Job, like I said, comes off pretty well. God, it's not his best PR work, at least for modern audiences. But it also brings up this question of why me? And when I'm stuck in the middle of this burnout and suffering and overwhelm, and why? It didn't help a lot. And I needed another scripture. So I started looking a little more. And I do what everybody does when you're faking knowledge. I Googled suffering and scripture, which I don't necessarily recommend because you get I got a lot of passages that were basically along the theme of take up your cross, rejoice in your suffering. Your suffering makes you more Christ-like. A lot of stuff from the epistles. Christ suffered and so do we, and so we should be glad of it, which was not what I needed to hear. It just proves that Google may not be the greatest for Bible study. But I get through all that, and as I'm reading through, trying to come up with something, I noticed I recognize that one. I know that one. That's the Beatitudes. I had to memorize the Beatitudes for confirmation forever ago, so I know like 2 of them. But Sermon on the Mount's not bad. And it was coming up to the deadline. I had to put some scripture in. So if worst comes to worst, nobody's ever felt worse for hearing the Beatitudes, so we'll throw that in. And again, Stuart read them beautifully. But as I read those, it's good stuff. But I noticed something. Many, many people are blessed for the suffering they go through. And there are some good things. Blessed are those who mourn, for you shall be comforted. Which is great, but I still have to mourn. Comfort is nice. It doesn't fix the thing I'm mourning about. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be satisfied. Satisfied sounds good, but you notice there's no statement about when that's going to happen. I'm still hungry and thirsty now. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. My more arrogant times, I feel like that's me. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, which is nice, but that's not so much here. There's a lot of validation for those who suffer. We still don't get is, how do I not suffer? How do I make it stop? How do I feel better? I looked a little further. And really the closest I seem to get is Jesus saying in this life, there will be suffering. Matter of fact, you look a little further. The Buddha said the same thing. First noble truth of Buddhism. Suffering is part of life. apparently the answer to why me, God, why am I suffering? Why me appears to be, why not you? It brings to mind the story a client shared with me recently. Gentleman, now a grandfather, but who was raised in a very conservative interpretation of Christianity, very much the thou shalt not question. And if you're suffering, it's because you did something wrong. Your faith was not strong enough. I've worked with a lot of folks from that background. He got a pretty intense dose, but he grows up. He does his best with it. He works through that, lives a professional life. It gets to the point where he's got a couple of teenagers who are struggling, or at least he's struggling with them. And as he's telling me this story, he talks about it as this is the point where both his life or his faith and his mental health hit kind of a turning point. This was the first time he'd really felt like this God who he was supposed to have a personal relationship with, he was supposed to be connected to, spoke back. And it was when he was out in his praying, and he describes it very dramatically, he looks up and he cries out to God, my kids are so screwed up. And the immediate response he hears inside is, have you seen mine? To which the only thing he could say was, yeah, God, I have. No, Lord, I'm one of them. Made me feel better. At least I'm not the only one who's crying out, why me? But there's still the suffering. There's still this burnout, this exhaustion. And the downside of what I do for a living is that people come to me with that question, why me? This is where Kathy and I have some things in common. We get those questions. I just have the advantage of being able to say, I'm sorry, our time is up. And one of the things I've come to notice over the past several years is that more and more when folks come to me with why am I hurting this much? Why is it this overwhelming? Why won't the pain stop? They get stuck. When I try to answer it, I certainly get stuck. Because we don't seem to have a better answer to why than why not. There seems to be an assumption from Job to me to all of us, that question of why, that it shouldn't be this way. We shouldn't hurt this way. These things shouldn't happen this way. And if they shouldn't, something's wrong and we have to go fix that. Where's the fix for that? And if we can fix it, it'll go away. And yet we come back to, in this life, there'll be suffering. Which is not to say, I want you to go enjoy suffering. Again, I Googled those passages. They made me angry. We've been suffering for a while. And to be clear, this has been a really hard time, and I'm ridiculously privileged. I haven't lost anybody to COVID. I haven't lost my job. We're financially, there are all these good things, and it's still just exhausting. So what do we do? Part of what I've found in my experience and psychological theory is that there are a couple of types, couple of parts to suffering, for lack of a better term. Tribulation, if you want to feel more dramatic, like my favorite, one of my favorite terms in the Bible. There is the pain. There is the thing causing the pain. There is the stabbing pain in my leg, the loss I've experienced, the uncertainty or the concern. There's the concern that makes me feel this discomfort. And then there is our distress about it. I shouldn't feel this way. I can't handle this feeling. If this doesn't stop, I'm going to die. One of those we often can't do much about. I don't have a lot of control over some of the things that happen. It turns out, with all of my intense work and talking and prayer, I can't stop a pandemic. Who knew? I can't get the Leviathan to rise. But I might have some more control over my response, over my distress, even if not my pain. One of the places this comes through most clearly in the work I've done with the people I've worked with is with folks in recovery. And most specifically through the Serenity Prayer that you may be familiar with. Originally written by Reinhold Niebuhr and adapted several times through a lot of places, including AA and other 12-step programs. Until it comes to us in this form: God, grant us the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I want to start with the disclaimer that this prayer, like most things, is something that some people find deeply helpful and others deeply annoying. Again, Googling, I searched it just to make sure I got the right title and the history of it, and I found, here's this, here are a couple things where it comes from, and here are various versions that basically come down to, I don't want to accept the things I can't change. Those are awful, those need to change, which I understand. But I think it misses the point, because that acceptance term can be powerful, but easily misinterpreted. Acceptance, at least as we use it as I use it in the mental health context, isn't about approval. It isn't about this is the way I want it. It isn't even about it being acceptable, that it's the way it should be. It's accepting that it is. I have this condition that causes pain. I have lost this person, these people, these relationships. I live in a society rooted in 600 years of slavery and white supremacy and racism. And not surprisingly, it's still around. I don't like it. I don't want it. I want it to be different. But I don't have the power to change that. I don't have the power to stop this virus, or even, it turns out, to make everybody get a vaccine, or listen to how I want them to do it. Heck, I don't even have the power to consistently make people wear masks in my office. I have to keep working. Should it be this way? I don't know that should's a particularly good answer. Because if you look at, here's what came before, yeah, that's how the rest of the equation plays out. The point of acceptance is not saying this is all okay. The point of saying this is where we're starting. This is what is. I have a body, so I will hurt. I have relationships, so I will sometimes feel loss or worry or betrayal. I have a brain, so I'm going to feel anxious. It is part of the deal. The thing about this prayer is not, it's going to happen. It is, let's split up what we're dealing with. I'm going to accept what I can't change. I can't change them. I can't change the past. I can't change the first things that are going to come to mind. I can't change the whirlwind. But there are things I can change. At the same time, there are things I can change. And if I can focus on that, if I can work towards that in some way, well, I don't know what exactly will happen. But here's what I see. Over and over again, as I work with folks, what I see is that when people are able to take a step to stop fighting what should be or what shouldn't be, I shouldn't be in pain. I shouldn't have this loss. They shouldn't be gone. And start from they are, and that hurts, and I'm going to hold that hurt, and I'm going to take the next step forward. That we get less stuck in the pain. The intensity can go down, but we feel less trapped. Even just accepting that I don't want to do this. I don't like this. This is not fun. This is scary. This is too much. But it's worth going forward and doing anyway. Makes it a little better. Trust me, I had that conversation with myself at 9:55 this morning. And what's more, very often learning, change, growth, wisdom, they come through suffering, not in spite of it. Now, again, don't go hurt yourself just to get wiser. But acknowledging that it is through those experiences that we tend to learn more. There is a book, speaking of being not a theologian, book by a novelist and satirist named Christopher Moore called Lamb, which is his retelling of the gospel, according to Biff, Christ's childhood friend who he made up, who got kicked out of the gospels because he was a jerk, frankly. But, it's his perspective. And it tells the story of, the missing years of Jesus's life, mostly to answer the question, what happened if Jesus learned Kung Fu? It's worth reading. It is profane and blasphemous, but it's worth reading. But then comes back to his version of the teachings. And there, you may remember the story, and I didn't look this one up to give you the scriptural reference, but the story of Jesus casting out the demon out of the legion, out of the man, and into a set of pigs, who then run off the cliff and die. And in Biff's retelling, this is as Jesus is going to go begin teaching to the Gentiles. And so they cross the water and they get out and they're greeted on the beach by this guy who has a demon and is raging, telling Jesus. And Jesus says, "Be gone," and I don't remember what the phrase is, and cast the demon out into the pigs. And the pigs go crazy and jump over the cliff and, die in the sea. And Jesus turns to this group of Gentiles coming at him, ready to be thanked and praised for saving their friend. Only to find out that the Gentiles are really rather upset with him because he just killed their entire flock of pigs. Because it turns out Gentiles can eat bacon. Those weren't unclean animals. That was lunch. And they have to get back in the boat because, and there is this wonderful line of his of, what'd you do? He said, what? It didn't occur to me. Pigs are unclean. I'm new at Gentiles. Clearly an apocryphal made-up story, but it really helps me to think that there are those times where even Jesus learned from mistakes, which doesn't mean there isn't suffering. It doesn't even make the suffering worth it all the time. But if what we can learn as we accept and change is that we're not as fragile as our anxieties tell us we are. And that we're not as alone in that distress, in that pain. Maybe that's useful. That's the best I could find. We as God's children may be so screwed up, but we're not alone. We're not fragile. We are capable of experiencing joy and suffering, even at the same time. And we can move through the pain, despite the pain, sometimes motivated by the pain, to create change in our lives and in the world. And we can be tired. As Nancy reminded us a couple of weeks ago, sometimes we push for that change and sometimes we sit and rest. And finding that balance, maybe that's the wisdom part. But I appreciate having you here to walk with me. So, here's hoping that we find some serenity, some acceptance, some change, and as much wisdom as we're going to earn through that process, one step at a time.